It's a challenge. This essay was given in 1957 by Joseph Campbell, and recall that in 1949 he had published The Hero with a Thousand Faces. And this was given at the Aranos conferences, and Campbell had by this point long been editing a series of volumes that were collecting the finest papers that were delivered in Europe at the Aranos conferences. And he was finally invited in 1957 to give a lecture, although he actually first attended the Aranos conferences in 1953. And he was beginning to think of himself, as a great scholar and well-rounded and coming out of the Jungian tradition. And at this time, however, he was not invited to speak. He and his wife went to Casa Aranos, as it was called, and they were invited. And he knew the work of most of the scholars who were there, Mircea Eliade and Erich Neumann. Jung, by this point, had retired from the conferences, so Campbell missed him. Jung's last lecture had been given in 1951 on the principle of synchronicity. And so here are all these marvelous scholars that Campbell regards himself as a peer of, and as it's described in his biography, everyone was flirting with his wife and so forth, and he was beginning to feel a little bit threatened and intimidated and probably tapping into his inferiorities, and it's written about very amusingly in his biography. And after it was over, he actually went to go visit Jung for the first and only time, and I don't think Jung really knew much about who he was or was even interested much in him. What we know about is that he and his wife went to visit them, went to Bollingen, and spent a couple of hours with him, and he arrived there and sat down and started listening to Jung talk. And Jung said, oh, by the way, do you know what the Hindus mean by Om? Now, if anyone knows, remember at this point, Campbell has been studying Hindu mythology for 12 years. And he's about to go to India in the following year. And Om is probably one of the most basic ABC things one could ask someone about Hindu mythology. So Campbell was feeling as though Jung were condescending to him, and probably we can imagine him feeling a little bit insulted. And then he begins to launch into an explanation of it, and Jung just waves his hand and he says, I was in Africa, and we were on an expedition, and we happened to come out of the woods, and I was with this group of anthropologists and so forth, and we came across another tribe, and we couldn't get a word out of them edgewise. They didn't know English, and we couldn't speak their language. And finally, after a certain point of frustration, we all just sort of sat down and began saying Om, Om, and everybody was saying it in unison. And then he said, there was another time where I was in India, and I was with a group of scientists, and we were up in the Himalayas, and we had just, it was early in the morning, the sun was just rising up over the Himalayas, and all these scientists were sort of coming out, marveling at this, and just at that point the sun sort of splintered off into all these sort of rainbow prisms all over the Himalayas, and the scientists spontaneously started going Om, Om. And he said, Om is the sound nature makes when it's in harmony with itself. And that broke the ice, and the two got along just fine after that, and they finished their conversation. And then when Campbell returned back to America, he sent Jung a copy of The Hero with a Thousand Faces. And Jung responded with a little note. It's printed in the biography of Campbell that said, thank you very much for your copy of The Hero with a Thousand Faces. I had actually already seen it and enjoyed it. And you're writing in the style of your mentor Heinrich Zimmer, and you're coming along very well. And I just wanted to thank you for a pleasant afternoon. So he gives him that little comment, and that's the story of his encounter with Jung. Now, the following year, in 1954 and 55, Campbell then journeys to India on a grant from the Bollingen Foundation, and he travels there, and this is recounted in his diaries, Bakshish and Brahman, and the second set of them hasn't been published, which recounts his journeys in Japan. But what you find when he goes to India, as I've mentioned before, is a great disillusionment with respect to this Hindu obsession now with politics. India at this time was not interested in metaphysics for the most part, and was beginning to become fascinated with the industrial nation state and forging its self-image, tracing out its politics and industry largely through Western stencils. And everywhere he just sort of found these beggars running up to him and asking for alms, and he began to see that as symptomatic of a general inferiority complex on the part of the Hindus, as the entire country begging from the West for goods and machinery, and then turning around and devaluing the West as materialistic and shallow, and vaunting themselves as spiritually superior, and even vaunting communism as the solution to these problems. And Campbell was a good old conservative and wasn't the least bit sympathetic to communism or socialism of any kind. And he just began to, as you read the diaries, you find him just making these little comments. I shall never speak or write about India again. And of course, it doesn't last. But then he goes to Japan, and when he's in Japan, he finds exactly the opposite. The Japanese are hip. They're with it. They're responding to the challenge of the modern world and their sort of post-World War II wreckage. They are building themselves with a great economic future, and they simply have taken on the machine. Hindus can't use machines. Everywhere you find Campbell telling these little stories about broken knobs and dials and the Hindus not bothering to repair anything. But the Japanese just picked up the machine and really have in many ways beat us at it. And he just found their attitude very with it and positive and together, and the whole Zen approach of doing things formally and elegantly and cleanly and nicely and recognizing the radiance, not in rejecting the world or turning away from it, but in embracing it, and really enjoyed the whole Japanese approach. And as a result of this conflict, this sort of contrast between the difference between the Hindu approach to spirituality and the Japanese approach, and the force of that contrast, he began thinking now that he should devote himself to writing about the differences between the world's great mythological traditions. And so from out of this comes the 4-volume opus, The Masks of God, which then, in counterpoint to The Hero with a Thousand Faces, which addressed itself to the similarities between cultures, he begins to turn now and look at all these little cosmological differences, how the differences in the world views. But as soon as he gets back from India, this is the first thing he writes, The Symbol Without Meaning, and this, in many ways, is this prelude to the Masks of God. And this, as I say, was delivered at the Aranos conferences, which was intensely a Jungian endeavor. The sort of Jungian theory of the archetypes had become a dogma by that point. And he decides now to sort of, good Irishman that he was, to sort of take issue with everyone and takes the theory of the archetypes and begins to pull it apart. And in particular, he focuses on the archetype of the mandala and begins to deconstruct it. Now, it had been one of Jung's primary assertions, we recall, that the mandala, the quadrated image, and the simplest mandala, the nucleus is simply just a cross, and it can sometimes be in circular form or it can be in a square form. But either way, it has to be quadrated. And according to Jung, this is really the nucleus of the psyche. This is the psyche expressing itself in terms of its deepest, most fundamental core unity, as though this were the nucleus of the atom, or the psyche's equivalent of the nucleus of the atom. In fact, he remarks in one of his essays how carbon, of which all living things are based, has a valency of 4, meaning that it can bond in 4 places with other atoms. And he begins to imply that the mandala may actually be rooted in this valency of 4 in carbon, of which all living things are made. And it explains why we find in all the great cosmological pictures of the world, in all the various traditions, that it is quadrated into this 4 parts, because it is universal to the human psyche to express itself in terms of these 4s, and also the theory of the unification of different conflicting pairs of opposites. But the whole point about the Jung's theory is that it's innate to the psyche. Well, Campbell comes in here and he begins to seize upon the weaknesses in the Jungian theory, which is its disregard for history and the evolution of history and archaeology and the gradual developments of mythological traditions. And he begins to find that the mandala is not innate to the psyche at all, but it is a historically conditioned form that can be dated precisely. Its emergence appears 5000 BC in the Near East and in Old Europe. And he says, the first thing that struck me about looking at Paleolithic art was the total absence of mandalas. If you look at the art of the caves in Lascaux or Les Trois Frères, there are no mandalas anywhere. There are images of the great herds, the sort of archetypal Platonic herds, and there are these little goddess carvings and so forth, and those are the 2 primary mythological images of the Paleolithic hunters, but there aren't any quadrated images anywhere. And you would expect for an image that is essential to the psyche, that expresses the quintessence of the psyche, that we would find it all throughout human history. But he says that that's not the case. We find it emerging right about 5000 BC, just as civilization is beginning to emerge and differentiate itself into a specialization of labor. And so you begin to get, he develops this theory that the mandala was created by the psyche as a response to the adaptations placed upon the individual living in a specialized society. With the emergence of the high civilizations in the Near East, in the Tigris and Euphrates River Valley, starting with the Sumerians,